You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Cable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, LRC Director Dick Feldman speaks with Susan Gass, Distinguished Professor from the Michigan State University Department of Linguistics and Germanic, Slavic, Asian, and African Languages. The two discuss pair work and how students learn from conversation rather than their partner's mistakes.
And what the novice teachers did was all yes-no questions. So it was to spot the difference. Do you have a door in your picture? And this experienced teachers would say, I have a door in my picture, what do you have in yours?
Susan Gass is a senior researcher in the field of second language acquisition who has published extensively on language pedagogy-related topics. Among other areas, she has been especially central to the development of the importance of interaction in language learning.
Today, I wanted to take the part a little bit of a naive language learning student who comes into class, and there's the teacher, and the first thing that happens, and something that happens a lot during the hour, is I'm asked to speak with another student instead of sitting there and listening to the teacher or watching stuff or doing drills and raising my hand with everybody giving an answer, like you do in a lot of other kinds of classes. In the field, we call this group work or pair work. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of students don't really understand what the value of it is. I want to talk with the teacher, not with another student.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And teachers often don't understand what the value of it is either. And let me just say something I hadn't thought about quite so much, but as a way of contextualizing this, I get it. I get why people don't want to speak. It can be embarrassing because you have to display what you know and what you don't know. And that, for many people, is very, very uncomfortable. And I think about my own experience. I lived in Italy for many years. I lived there for about 5 or 6 years, and I still go back and I spend summers there. And my Italian used to be very, very good. Good enough that I even translated a book from English into Italian on automobile racing. So that's sort of to contextualize where I used to be many years ago. So now I go back, as I said, every summer, and it's embarrassing. I don't want to go into a store and say very much. I don't want to participate in conversations, even though I know that there's value in that. It's just it's a difficult thing to do because, as I said, you're putting your knowledge on display or your lack of knowledge on display.
So some people say that fear is the greatest problem in language learning.
In some sense, that's right. That you have to be willing to make those mistakes, and I'll say a little bit more about that because one of the things that happens in pair work or group work is, as you say, people. I don't want to talk with my fellow classmate. I'm just going to pick up all her mistakes. Well, actually, there's been research that looks at transcripts of classrooms, and you know what? You don't pick up mistakes. What you do is you learn from your partner or others in your group. So you're talking and you hear something that they say and you start thinking, really, is that right? And you might say it, but then that person corrects you, or maybe not corrects you overtly, but repeats what she had said. And so that in and of itself becomes part of the learning process. Sometimes partners will sit and talk about the language. So, you said this, is it a feminine noun or is it a masculine noun for languages that have gender? And they may just talk about it and come to some sort of agreement. We've got lots of data that show where there's what we call negotiation, where you'll talk about this and one person will say this and another person will say that. And it's that noticing, what we call is noticing a gap between what you're saying and what the other person is saying that helps learning. it's the overt correction or repetition. So not to become too technical about it, but there's what are called recasts. So if you say something and then I repeat it, but I repeat it correctly, that's called a recast. And that sort of...
It's something we do in conversation sometimes anyway,
exactly. Right? It happens all the time. Now, it's good for language learning if the person is sensitive to that being a sort of correction. And sometimes it's not even intended as a correction. It's intended sort of as a clarification. But if you're sensitive to that, it gets you thinking. And I know, and it doesn't always mean that what you've said is wrong. It could be just another way of saying the same thing. And I think back to, about a year or so ago when I was in Italy and I was in a bakery and I wanted to get something. And I must have said something like, is the pizza in arrivo, arriving? And the person said something different. And I was left thinking, did what I say, was what I said wrong? Or was it just an alternative way of saying something? So about a year later, I was teaching a course in Italy, and I gave this an example, and the students all said, oh, yeah, what you said was fine. It was just an alternative way. So it can be confusing, but it is an indication. It got me thinking about what it was. And so it becomes a forum for learning. And as I said, the mistakes that usually when you've got something right, you know it. You know when you're right. When you're wrong, there may be that little bit of question, is this right? I'm not sure about it. So that's, in a sense, why you don't pick up your mistakes from the others, because you know you're right. And so you're not likely to change your form. And as I say, I've got lots of examples where they negotiate their way to back and forth.
Because sometimes when you're saying something in a conversation with somebody and they don't, you can tell that you're not getting your point across. They aren't understanding you.
Right.
That can actually be very productive.
Exactly. Because what you're given is some sort of signal, either from your partner in the class or from a teacher or from a native speaker if you're in a study abroad environment, that will give you an indication that what you're saying is just not getting across, as you said. Now, what that means for you as a student or as a language learner is I got to figure out what the problem is. It could be my grammar. It could be that I'm using the wrong gender on a noun. That usually won't interfere too much with communication. Is it that I'm using the wrong vocabulary item? Is it my pronunciation? So then that doesn't give you the information. It's going to take more overt commentary, like that's wrong, this isn't the right word, or that's wrong, the pronunciation should be this.
It's learning what you don't know.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's exactly what it does. That feedback gives you an indication that there is a problem, and then you have to figure it out. And what's interesting in all of this is that the feedback that you're given is more beneficial in certain parts of language than others. So if you give me some feedback, let's say a recast or something a little bit more direct, or just say what I didn't quite understand what you said, it is much more beneficial when it's for vocabulary. It's more beneficial if it's for pronunciation. It's not so beneficial if it's for morphology, so word endings. The learners don't pick that up. They interpret that kind of correction as something else, as correction of vocabulary, or so it depends on what it is that you're correcting. It also depends on your proficiency level. What you have to, if you're going to be able to make a correction, you have to have enough language knowledge to be able to correct it. So the proficiency level will play a part. And one example that I have was, this was a student teacher, not just so much student, but where the student was obviously wavering between two forms. And then the native speaker, and I believe it was a teacher, came in and did a recast with the correct form, and then that set the student on his way to getting it right.
I've thought that is kind of the critical moment for the art and insight of the teacher.
Exactly.
To see that a student is on the borderline in something, and to give just that little nudge that helps the student acquire and cement down the form.
And that's experience. It's hard to think about how you would teach that in graduate programs. There's a lot that just comes. I mean, I've done work on talk between teachers and students, and the difference between novice teachers and more experienced teachers. And it's the kinds of things, and what I did was a brief intervention. This was with a colleague of mine, and we did about a 20-minute intervention, and we were able to modify the way that the novice teachers talked with students. It didn't last. They started drifting back into their old ways when the conversation became difficult, or all sorts of things intervened. But at least you know that you can begin to get people or teachers to think about it. You know, what you're talking about, that aha moment that the student is about to get or has just gotten, when then you can go in and sort of nail it, finish it up. That takes experience and confidence in being a teacher. And teachers don't always have that.
It's hard to change the way a teacher teaches. Most people want to teach the way they were taught.
That's another problem.
And most students want to be taught the way they've been taught.
Right. But I think, you know, when you say that, that's kind of interesting to think about, because I would imagine as time goes on and students are begin to be taught differently, then they may have different expectations. I remember one of the positions that I have is where you started off in ESL. I direct an English Language Center. And when I first took over as director, we were doing, I'm trying to remember now, some curricular changes. And we were getting rid of just strict grammar teaching. And boy, did we have to work with the students. They didn't want it. The teachers were fine. It wasn't the teachers who had a problem. But the students, you know, where's my grammar class? I want you to tell me what to say and when, and, you know, and how. And we had to do a lot of student training in that. And, you know, when you think about it with understanding recasts or other corrections, you can think about it in the same way. Some teachers, actually, we go through learner training at our center.
Oh, good.
And so some of this is just listen carefully to what I say. So if you say X and I say Y right after you, that may be, I don't want to interrupt the conversation of what you're saying, but think about it, because that may be a subtle indication to you that when you said X, it wasn't quite right.
Yeah, one of the subtle things about teaching, as I see it, is you want to teach form in a meaning context.
Yeah.
So those are sometimes in contrast with each other. So it's not so obvious how to do that.
I will say that I am a big form person. I like teaching form. I think there's a place for it.
I've sometimes felt in my ESL classes that it's a topic of conversation as interesting as anything else sometimes.
Right. I mean,
when did the person do this action?
Yes.
And what was the relationship of that action with another one, really?
Exactly.
That's a conversation.
That's a conversation. Another conversation is you hear everybody in the class doing something or struggling to say something. Stop the class. Do a regular grammar lesson for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. They may need that. They may need it's. I mean, you can think of it as efficiency. I know not everybody would agree with me, but I think of it as efficiency. Why are you going to? As everybody, I mean, I am also a believer of having students struggle through things to make it their own. But there's a certain point that you can just stop the class and say, "Look, all of you are struggling with relative clauses, and you're putting, well, not to be too technical, a resumptive pronoun where we don't do it in English. And most of the students will do that. So just stop the class, talk about it for a few minutes, give a little mini lesson, and then go on your merry way.
Work that mostly the students do out of class, reading their grammar book.
They might do out of class, but they just aren't getting it. Just the classroom is a place to facilitate what they're doing, to make it more efficient in times. I mean, there is a time and place. So I'm not against using the classroom, even flipped classrooms where you are doing a lot of that out of class. Sometimes they just don't get it. It's not enough. And
that, again, that's the insight of the teacher to say, this is a moment where people, I think, can profit from this.
That, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's hard to know in teacher training classes how to get teachers to understand what that moment is. But maybe it's what sort of in-service training should be doing, which we don't have that much at university levels as much as they do in the public school environment.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, we do have professional development, but they usually don't target things like that. You know, how do you know when it's time to stop the class and do this? How do you know when it's that a recast may not be working and you have to be a little bit more explicit? How do you know when students are about to come to that aha moment?
Yeah, those are issues, and experience certainly is the main thing there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I know some of our programs pretty much tell the new TAs, don't get into explaining grammar in class, because they may not know how to do it. They may go on too long. They may not get through the rest of what they need to do.
And because that's something that they think they can do, then they overdo it. Like you say, go on too long. Just kill it. They just go way more than they should, and they don't know what that balance is.
And for some teachers are more comfortable going on and on about a grammar explanation than they are the more delicate management of the group and scaffolding people as they have these conversations.
And stopping them and sort of coming into the group and knowing what to say and when to say it. And it really is much easier to just, talk about the past tense or whatever, put an ED here, except certain ones that don't have an ED. That's easy. And that's what novice... It was interesting when we did our novice and experienced study to see what they did, because what we did in that study is we
study of novice and experienced teachers.
Right. What we did is we paired a novice teacher, this was ESL, with an ESL student. So they were doing an activity, a spot the difference task, I think it was. So we had a number of pairs, novice teacher and student, novice teacher and student. We had others ones, experienced teachers and students. And what we were looking at is the way that the experienced teachers and novice teachers interacted with the student. So we taped that, and that was like maybe a 10, 12-minute interaction. Then we took that tape, and immediately afterwards, so there was no memory lapse, it wasn't 2 days later, we sat down, the researcher, actually was one of our graduate students, sat down with the teachers one-on-one, showed them the video, and asked them to comment on this. Why did you do this? Why did you say that? And some of it was with the interaction, with correction. Well, I didn't want to correct him because he would feel bad. That's what the novice teacher said. The experienced teachers would do things like, yes, that was a great teaching moment. That's why I did that. And we never got that from the novice teachers. They were very concerned with themselves, with how they were being perceived. They were just concerned with getting through this so-called lesson. They were concerned about the students' feelings. They were concerned about managing it. So one of it was we wanted to see how they started the conversation. And what the novice teachers did was all yes-no questions. So it was to spot the difference. Do you have a door in your picture? And this experienced teachers would say, I have a door in my picture. What do you have in yours? To get the students to talk so that then there could be an opportunity for feedback and turn it into a learning process. And the novice teachers couldn't do that. It was just yes, no questions. They couldn't get beyond that. They were worried about the students, how they would feel. They didn't want the student to talk. They thought, I should talk. I'm the native speaker. I should do all the talking. And it was really kind of interesting to see it from
it's an interesting case. Yeah,
their perspective.
We've been talking about things teachers need to do and understand, and what experience helps them do better. Sort of to finish up here, what are some of the things that you tell students and when you do learner training? What do students need to do to be a good language learner?
I think they need to pay attention. First of all, they have to be sensitive to what their partners are doing. We don't have so much problem nowadays with internet. I'm talking about international students talking with their partners, but some of it is just telling them what the benefits of speaking are. Our classes, unfortunately, are very often all from one background, and so that becomes a problem. So it's talking to them about what the benefits of speaking are. It's talking to them about sort of noticing what differences there might be. It's talking to them about listening to their teachers and trying to understand what the teachers are saying that might be different.
I guess in a fairly simplistic idea I've had for a long time comes from the idea that you had students who old-fashioned grammar classes.
Yeah.
And the idea is you learn what you practice.
Yeah.
So if what you've practiced is speaking about the grammar in your native language, well, you get to be able to do well at that. If you speak in class in the target language, well, then you're going to learn to do that.
Right. And I think that times language teaching around the world is getting better. So I think we don't have. I mean, this is obviously a big generalization, and it's only valid, I think, in some contexts. But you are getting away from just strict grammar classes. So I think that students are coming in with a better variety of language preparation, of language teaching. I was in Saudi Arabia last week and so impressed with the language teaching that's going on there. I mean, I was at a university and it was, obviously a unique environment, but they are working on a major project now of language training to work with high school teachers all over every single high school teacher in the country. So I think that, if you start looking at the seriousness with which language teaching, and it's mostly English, is being taken around the world, it is improving. And I think that we're going to start seeing, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, students who are very different than the ones that we've been dealing with.
Well,
so that's my optimistic
note there, yes.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.